All right, we are back. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're getting ready. We're just about done with chapter 12, and so what I'd like to do is quickly review some of what we did, and then we can go into 13, where we will be looking at an interesting discussion about the history of exchange rates, and we're going to actually see some very interesting videos about, well, you'll see when we get to it, but a lot of this has to do with history, specifically the history of different exchange rate systems that have been used throughout the world, including the United States. But let's just take a quick look back at what we were doing in chapter 12, because this is awfully important. This model that we've been setting up, which attempts to explain how exchange rates are determined in the short run. Okay, so specifically, let me quickly remind you that this whole model is based on this equation. Specifically, if we're looking at the dollar and the pound, let's see, where is it? Well, I could just write it. So we have this framework which resembles very closely the supply and demand framework that we normally use for any other type of good or service, and not just exchange rates, but just about every good or service you can imagine can be analyzed ultimately with supply and demand curves. So you might recall that the equation that we were looking at was this. So why is it set up this way? Well, this is the return to the dollar. So we call this the known return. To the dollar. And what we have here on the right-hand side is what we will call the expected return to the pound. Why do I say expected? Because the return to the pound depends on two things. Number one, the actual rate of interest we can earn by holding pounds. And secondly, the exchange rate change that will occur during the period in which we hold our deposits, in this case, euro sterling. So we've got two components to this, equals the pound rate of interest, we'll call it, plus the expected appreciation or depreciation of the dollar, which is not something that's actually known to us, but we believe we know, we think we know, and therefore that's good enough for us to make a decision as to where we should hold our funds. Now, typically, we're assuming here that the decision is between holding euro dollars or euro sterling, because that's a very safe investment in either case. We don't want to get involved with measuring risk here. So instead, we'll assume that we have the opportunity to earn either the euro dollar rate if we're holding dollars, or else the euro sterling rate if we convert our dollars into pounds. So the unfortunate reality, though, is that we can't ever really be sure what the return will be if we hold pounds, because again, the exchange rate can change. And of course, if the exchange rate goes up, meaning the dollar gets weaker, that will increase the return to holding pounds. But if it goes down, that will reduce the return. So in a case like this, we're hoping, because we're not hedging our risk with a forward contract, we have to be very careful. In these examples, or in this model, we are not hedging our foreign exchange risk with the forward contract. Therefore, we are exposed to foreign exchange risk. Specifically, if we hold euro sterling, a euro sterling deposit, I should say, which means that our money is denominated in pounds or sterling, and the dollar depreciates. This will increase our rate of return. If the dollar appreciates, this will, of course, do the opposite, decrease our rate of return. So we don't know what might happen. We're going on our instincts, trying to say to ourselves, listen, we're pretty confident that if we hold a euro sterling deposit account, the dollar is not likely to appreciate, which would reduce our rate of return. We're hoping that either the dollar stays where it is or else possibly it gets weaker during the period in which we hold a euro sterling account. So now when the two are equal to each other, though, then we say that the exchange rate market is in equilibrium. So in other words, when this is true, the market is in equilibrium. Okay, and of course, when it's in equilibrium, that means that nobody has an incentive to switch their funds from one currency to the other. So we'll add that here. No one has an incentive to switch their funds from one currency to the other. And that's why we call it equilibrium, because everybody's happy. There's no incentive for anybody to shift funds around between the two currencies. And therefore, the exchange rate will stay where it is until something comes along and changes it. In other words, other outside factors could still come along and disturb this equilibrium. But right now, at this point, everything's fine. As far as investors are concerned, there's no reason for them to switch back and forth between the two currencies. And in fact, we can rearrange this equation algebraically and solve for the equilibrium exchange rate. So in other words, this relationship implies that the equilibrium exchange rate itself is, so we rearranged it once before algebraically, and we discovered that we had the expected future exchange rate in the numerator, and then we had 1 plus the dollar rate minus the pound rate in the denominator. This is where we expect to find equilibrium. And so now, of course, we know that that's not always true. The market's not always in equilibrium, but if it's not, it should automatically adjust itself until it is in equilibrium, just like with any other supply and demand situation. So we drew a graph to show what this looks like. And so you might recall that to show how this works, we have on the vertical axis the exchange rate quoted as so many dollars per pound. Over here we have the rate of return. We'll call that a percentage. And then we had the US rate of return here. And then the expected UK rate looks like this. And where they cross, we define that as our equilibrium exchange rate. Let's call that 0.1. And so that's where we expect the equilibrium exchange rate to be. Now, what happens if one of these factors changes? All right, well, there's three things that can happen with this framework. Okay, so we have, in the first case, what happens if the US rate of interest changes? And that can happen because, let's say, the Federal Reserve System decides to tighten up or loosen monetary policy. So if we started here, let's say the US rate goes up, this is where we wind up. So point 2, the dollar stronger. All right. So what this is telling me is that as the US rate rises, and in this case, that would be the euro dollar deposit rate, the US rate rises, the dollar gets stronger. Why is that, by the way? Because what's happening is that dollars are now more attractive than sterling. And so investors will shift their funds out of euro sterling into euro dollars, and that will push up the strength of the dollar. Okay, so that's really the logic behind this. Because remember, in the short run, we're assuming that the only reason people want to hold foreign currencies is to earn a higher rate of return than they can get in the home market. So therefore, anything that makes the dollar more attractive than the foreign currency will cause that to happen. In other words, as the US rate rises, the dollar becomes relatively more attractive to investors than the pound. So investors react by, selling pounds, buying dollars. And this causes the dollar to appreciate. It's just that simple, okay? Suddenly the demand for dollars is stronger. People want to buy more dollars. They want to sell off their pounds. And there you go. You've got a stronger dollar. There we are. Now, of course, this works both ways. Let's go back here and show that if I move the opposite direction, let's just say over here to the left somewhere, let's call this R3. Well, then obviously all this works in reverse. Now the US rate of interest is lower. And so as a result, it's not as attractive as the pound. Okay, so we have the opposite scenario here. And we'll say that as US rate falls, the opposite happens because now everybody wants to have pounds because they're giving us a higher rate of return than the dollar. And it's really just that simple. And the reaction time is very quick. I mean, investors notice this right away. And since they're only holding these different currencies to maximize their rate of return, even if it's just a relatively small amount of difference, they'll still likely move at least some of their funds out of dollars and into pounds. Okay, so as the US rate falls, the dollar becomes relatively less attractive to investors than the pound. So investors react by, of course, they do the opposite, selling dollars, buying pounds, and this causes the dollar to depreciate. Okay, so that's exactly what you would expect. Everything works in reverse. So again, the whole point of this is that higher interest rates make a currency stronger. Lower interest rates make it weaker because it affects the rate of return to investors who are holding that currency. That's the bottom line. All right, so we see the two possible changes in the US rate. Changes in the UK rate work in exactly the same way. The UK can change its rates of interest just as easily as the US, possibly through monetary policy, possibly for other reasons. So let's see. So we start here. The US rate will stay fixed. The UK rate will start here at, let's call it R pound 1. And we'll assume no changes in expectations. All right, so we start at equilibrium rate right here, E1. Now, if the UK rate goes up, this entire curve shifts up. So what's happening now is that all of a sudden, once again, the pound is more attractive than the dollar. So how do people react to that? Well, you know how they react. By holding more pounds and less dollars, okay? So as the UK rate rises, the dollar becomes relatively less attractive than the pound to investors who react by buying pounds, well, selling dollars. They have to do that first, and then buying pounds. And of course, this means that the dollar gets weaker. This causes, as you can imagine, this causes the dollar to depreciate. And that's exactly what we see on the graph. As E goes up, the dollar is getting weaker. So therefore, we have a weaker dollar because of the fact that the British have raised their interest rates. Now I'll show the opposite on the same axes. If I move down here, then of course all this works in reverse. Let's have this as R3. And so, oh, I forgot to label something here. That's better. Okay. And then here we have 3. And this one is caused by the UK rate falling. Okay, and of course you can see that at a lower E, remember when E falls, the dollar is actually getting stronger because it's quoted as dollars per pound. So therefore, we say that the reverse works as well. In this case, we say that as the UK rate falls, the dollar becomes relatively more attractive than the pound to investors who react by, now they're doing the opposite, selling pounds, buying dollars. And this, of course, causes the dollar to appreciate. Okay. So we can have either case. A higher British rate weakens the dollar, a lower British rate strengthens the dollar. All right, and then there's one more possibility. What about expectations? Now, investors' behavior depends to a large degree on their expectations. So how does that work here? All right, so here's our expectations term. I'll call it E1 because I need to change it. And so this is our original point. And now what's happening is that suppose this term increases. What does that actually mean? What's happening is that investors, this goes up because investors are more pessimistic about the dollar. In other words, they're expecting it to get weaker in the future. And so, as you can imagine, that has a very negative effect on the dollar. In fact, it forces the dollar to get weaker. And here's why. Okay, so as the expected value of the dollar, or as the dollar is expected, actually, let's try this again. As investors become more pessimistic about the dollar, investors react by, and so you can imagine, selling dollars, buying pounds. This causes the dollar to depreciate. Right? Just because people think the dollar is going to get weaker, they start selling it, and before you know it, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, so we go back to this curve, and we'll do the opposite, of course, as you can probably guess. We'll let it come down here. And now at 0.3, the dollar is quite a bit stronger, as a matter of fact. Why did this happen? Because investors are more optimistic about the dollar. So what do? All right, well, everything works in reverse now, as you can probably guess. As investors become more optimistic about the dollar, investors react by selling pounds and buying dollars. And this causes the dollar to appreciate. All right. So, and again, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right. So in a nutshell, that's the model we were developing. But the conclusions that we draw from this, we could summarize this, I guess. The conclusion we draw from this is that in the short run, a currency will appreciate if the domestic interest rate rises, the foreign interest rate falls, or investors become more optimistic about the currency. Okay, now obviously this works in both directions. In the short run, a currency will depreciate if the domestic interest rate falls, the foreign interest rate rises, or investors become more pessimistic about the currency. So that's what the model is basically telling us. In the long run, what matters is prices. We saw that earlier. In the short run, we're looking at rates of return. So anything that makes a currency more attractive will cause it to get stronger. Anything that makes it less attractive, that will cause it to become weaker. Okay. So that's what that model was all about. There's a lot of buildup to it, but that's really all it is in the short run. I mean, in a nutshell, that's all it is. And then we also have our equation for the equilibrium exchange rate. We have this equality that represents the equilibrium condition in this market. So it's a pretty straightforward model. It just may not have seemed that way in the beginning because there was a lot of details going on. But that's really what it's telling us. So in other words, in the short run, we're assuming that people think of currencies as simply being another type of financial investment. And so all they want to do is they want to know which of these two currencies will give me the best return. And that's going to determine which one I'm willing to hold. All right, now it's time for the next chapter, 13, which is very different than this one because we're looking at how trade affects the economy Specifically, if you recall from way back in the beginning, we talked about the balance of payments, and specifically we were looking at the current account. And I'll just remind you here that the current account consists of net exports of goods and services, net income receipts, we called them, and net unilateral transfers, in other words, gifts. So what we would like to know is if a country's current account either experiences a surplus or a deficit, how does the economy react to that? And so we're going to see that there have been, over the centuries, several different theories as to how the current account balance adjusts to the state of the economy. And so we're going to start out by looking back about, I'd say about 300 plus years, 250 years, let's say, into the past. We're going to look back at a very different time during the colonial days of the United States. And we're going to see different theories that were put forth to explain how the current account balance adjusts to international trade. And so we're going to see that there's different ways of approaching this, but each one of them depends on what was going on at that point in history. Because there have been different types of exchange rate systems that have been used through time, some of which we're using now and some of which we're not. So, for example, exchange rates, for the most part, fall into one of two basic categories. We can have what are called floating exchange rates, which is what we have now, by the way, which means that their strength is determined by the interaction of supply and demand, although sometimes central banks may intervene to prevent large fluctuations in the values of their currencies. We call that a flexible or floating exchange rate system because the markets ultimately determine the strengths of these currencies. In history, though, we've seen several cases where instead governments would adopt what's called a fixed exchange rate system or regime, where the government deliberately, in conjunction with the central bank, deliberately went out of its way to take steps to ensure that the country's exchange rate was fixed at a specific level. And they would do what they had to do to keep it at that level. Now, you might wonder, why would anybody do that? Well, again, it depends on each country's circumstances and also what's going on in the rest of the world. So with a fixed exchange rate regime, suppose that we had a fixed exchange rate system. The dollar is fixed with respect to the pound and the euro and the yen and all the rest of the currencies. It's not allowed to fluctuate. So if the dollar starts to strengthen for whatever reason, the central bank would be forced to increase the domestic money supply, which would lower interest rates to keep the dollar from getting too strong. So therefore, if the dollar is getting too weak, then the central bank would be forced to do the opposite, start to reduce the money supply, so that we want interest rates to start rising, and that would cause the dollar to get stronger. So in other words, with a fixed exchange rate system, the central bank is constantly adjusting the money supply to ensure that the currency doesn't move from its fixed position. Now, there aren't that many countries at this point in time that are actually doing this, but one good example is Hong Kong. Right now, at this point in time, Hong Kong, and they've had this for quite a few years now, their exchange rate is fixed at a rate of 7.8 Hong Kong dollars per US dollar. I don't know where they came up with that number, but that's apparently the number that seems to work best for them. So what happens is the Central Bank of Hong Kong now has to step in and intervene by either increasing or decreasing the domestic money supply anytime the Hong Kong dollar starts to strengthen or weaken. Now, the name of the Hong Kong Central Bank is the Monetary Authority of Hong Kong. And so if the Hong Kong dollar starts to get too strong, the central bank will lower interest rates in order to prevent the Hong Kong dollar from getting any stronger. On the other hand, if the Hong Kong dollar starts to weaken, then they have to do the opposite. They have to step in and start raising interest rates to keep it stronger and prevent it from depreciating too much, because they're obligating, or they've committed themselves to keeping it at the same rate of 7.8 Hong Kong dollars to a US dollar. So that raises an interesting question. Why are they doing this? What's the point? Why don't they just let it float like the United States does? Well, here's some of the main reasons why a country might want to do this. Number one, it can provide stability to a nation's currency. Number two, it can help reduce interest rates. And number three, it can help reduce inflation. So a lot of countries who have adopted fixed exchange rates, they did so not because they really wanted to, but because their inflation rates were very high, or their currencies were very unstable, or else they had very high interest rates, all of which were harming the economy. And so obviously those were all bad things. And so they decided, you know what, why don't we go ahead and fix our currency? And also, another one that's not really mentioned here is that because it reduces uncertainty about the value of that currency, it means that people who are doing business in Hong Kong do not have to worry about foreign exchange risk. In other words, if you can be guaranteed that this exchange rate will never change, you don't have to hedge any transactions that you make in Hong Kong. And that's exactly what they want. Now, what's the drawback? Why doesn't everybody do this? Because you lose control over your own monetary policy. So we'll see how and why that happens in a bit. But it turns out that you lose the ability to conduct monetary policy when you have a fixed exchange rate. All right. Now, I did find, as I said, some really good videos that'll help introduce this topic in a very interesting way. So why don't we check these out? So hold on, let me go get the list. And we'll start with a video about floating exchange rates. What are they all about and how do they work? All right, so let me fire this over to you. And let's take a look. All right, let me turn off the screen and here we are. So when I would get a hotel.
encouraging overseas consumers to buy Aussie products. Import spending will fall as imports become more expensive. Nevertheless, once we're done with earnings, we see added
Okay, I thought that was especially well done. It was a nice little summary. We did some of that earlier on in one of the earlier chapters, but it's good to review this every chance we get to look at how um, exchange rates are determined by the interaction between supply and demand. And so these are known as floating or flexible exchange rates because they will change whenever there's a change in any economic variables that you can imagine, like changes in interest rates, changes in inflation, changes in anything you could imagine could cause currencies to move around in value. And so this is called, like she said, a floating or flexible exchange rate system. And it has a lot of advantages to it, like one of them being that if the economy, like she said, slows, then the exchange rate will depreciate, which helps stimulate exports, and that should help bring the economy back to its original level. And so, in a lot of ways, flexible exchange rates are helpful in helping the economy adjust to any issues that may arise. And also, it means that the central bank doesn't have to be bothered intervening in the foreign exchange markets because that would take up a lot of its time. And so it's not something that you undertake lightly. In other words, having a fixed exchange rate, the opposite case, is a very serious commitment because it does require a lot of time and effort, and it does require a lot of adjustments by that economy. But in some cases, it makes a lot of sense. So anyway, so let's see what's next. Oh, let's see. Oh, well, now we are going to the other extreme where we will consider fixed exchange rates. Okay. We have to understand both of these. Although, like I said before, in the majority of the cases throughout the world right now, at this point in time, most exchange rates are either floating or flexible. There aren't that many countries right now that have fixed exchange rates. All right, let's check this out. All right, are we done? All right, so now, I believe it or not, I actually found a short video about why Hong Kong pegs its currency to the dollar. Okay, because that's exactly what we were just talking about, that specific example of Hong Kong. Although they're not the only ones, at this point in time, there aren't a whole lot of countries that do have fixed exchange rates. So, Hong Kong being one of the few exceptions. So, why don't we find out what that's all about? All right, so hold on one second. All right, here we are. I guess we're done. All right. So now we're going to go back to the notes for a few minutes. We're actually going to delve back into history for a bit. And you'll see that we'll be revisiting a time when most of the world was on the gold standard. And that explains part of the reason why some of these theories were developed the way they were. And so let's go back. Well, first, let me turn on the screen again. And so we're going to look at this concept of price adjustments. So under this, what we're seeing here is that the idea that a current account surplus or deficit may actually lead to changes in domestic prices. A surplus may actually lead to higher domestic prices because the demand for that country's products is so strong, but that unfortunately would help reduce increase imports and decrease exports so that the current account surplus would start to disappear as this happens. And in fact, we're assuming that in the long run, we don't really have to make any changes to influence our current account surplus or deficit because it will take care of itself through the adjustment of domestic prices, or at least that's the theory. Now, on the other hand, if like the United States, we have deficits all the time, which we do, the deficit may cause lower domestic prices, and that would decrease our imports, increase our exports, and what's going to eventually happen is that the current account deficit should shrink up and disappear. Now, we know that that's exactly what's not happening. The U.S. current account deficit just seems to keep getting worse all the time. So there must be some flaw in this argument. But the notion of this adjustment through prices came about during the 18th century when circumstances were very different. Specifically, most countries are on the gold standard, and we're going to see what difference that really makes to how prices adjust in response to a current account surplus or deficit. So what we have to do is take a step back and introduce a very famous historical figure named David Hume. Now, David Hume was one of these people who made contributions in a lot of different areas. In particular, he was a philosopher, a historian, and one of the earliest economists. And he left behind a lot of writings which were very influential on everybody that followed him. So he's considered to be one of the big figures in the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. And when it came to economics, he was of the view that trade should be free, that governments should not interfere with it. And in fact, at that point in time, most countries had the opposite outlook. A lot of countries held the view that trade was simply another instrument of warfare. Okay, in other words, they saw trade as an opportunity to exploit the other countries and take advantage of them. That was the prevailing philosophy at the time, and it was referred to as mercantilism. So during this period from the 16th to the 18th centuries until Hume comes along, gains from trade are seen as coming at the expense of other nations. So exports are strongly encouraged by governments, while imports are strongly discouraged. In other words, the governments felt that they could exploit their other neighbors, their other countries, by continuously running up huge trade surpluses and then demanding to be paid in gold for the deficits that the other countries had run up, and then use that gold to build up bigger armies and navies. So that's why they thought this was just another way of carrying out warfare by insisting to be paid in gold for any deficits that might arise. That would make it possible for these countries to acquire so much gold and silver that they could then build the world's largest armies and navies. And that in turn would make it possible to conquer other countries and also to acquire colonies, especially in North and South America. So this mercantilist philosophy under this philosophy, trade was seen simply as an instrument of foreign policy, specifically just warfare in a different format. Now, David Hume came along and said, this is not a very good philosophy, because ultimately, even if you do acquire these enormous current account surpluses, all that's going to happen is that prices will adjust until the current account surplus eventually disappears. Okay, so in other words, you're wasting your time, because if you have a big current account surplus, your currency will get stronger. That will discourage imports. It'll increase exports. It'll discourage exports and encourage imports. And before you know it, your current account surplus is gone. And he also had philosophical objections to this theory anyway. And of course, Adam Smith later on came along and pointed out in The Wealth of Nations that trade can only take place if it's mutually beneficial to all the parties involved. Now, as I mentioned before, when Hume was writing this is around the time of the American Revolution, most countries in the world were on the gold standard, which meant that the supply of money in an economy equals the amount of gold that you happen to have in your country. Okay, so in other words, you have X amount of gold, and that gold represents the money supply. Now, the problem with that is that the supply of gold did not increase very quickly at all. Finding gold was very difficult. So most countries' money supplies would tend to be very stable, which is a good thing in the sense that it kept inflation lower than it otherwise would have been. But it's a bad thing in the sense that if your economy is struggling, it's not possible to stimulate the economy by, let's say, increasing the money supply and reducing interest rates. The central banks at the time had very little control over the money supply, which meant that they really could not realistically carry out monetary policy. So the gold standard had good things about it and it had bad things about it. Eventually, it disappeared in the early 1930s. The United States went off the gold standard about that time, and most other countries abandoned it around that same time. Now, what was true about the gold standard was that, as I said before, the domestic money supply consisted entirely of gold or possibly paper money backed by gold. As a matter of fact, if you want to see an example of this, let me just do a little detour here for you. Oh man, I have to make sure I remember the link. There it is. I just want to quickly show you that in the early 20th century, in the United States, paper money, at least some of it, was redeemable into gold. In other words, this $1,000 bill, which was issued in 1907, if you see in the very bottom, it says in gold coin. That means that I can take this $1,000 bill to the bank and insist that they give me $1,000 worth of gold in exchange for it. So in other words, we say that this dollar bill, this $1,000 bill, is backed by gold in the sense that it is simply a receipt for the deposit of gold somewhere in the country. And that means that anytime I choose, I can take my paper money and insist on being paid for it in gold. So for all practical purposes, I don't need the actual gold because I know that it's there if I want it. So that was common until the 30s. And in fact, if you look at these, all of them have the same thing in common. This is a $10 bill that could be redeemed for gold. This is 1907. Let's see if there's any more interesting ones here. All of these could be redeemed for gold. Now, the latest example of this is one that I think you'll find interesting. The San Francisco Fed doesn't actually seem to have this in their collection. So I'll find a picture of this for you. You might find this very interesting. Oh, that kind of ruins it. Here it is. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that this is a $100,000 bill, and it says right on it, gold certificate. It was issued in 1934, just before we went off the gold standard. And that means if you had this in your possession, you could take it to a bank and insist on being given $100,000 worth of gold anytime you wanted. So we're still now at this point on the gold standard, which means paper money is redeemable for gold. So you could spend gold directly, or you could spend paper money directly, with the understanding that anytime it could be converted back into gold. So that's what we mean by the gold standard. Now, of course, those days are long gone. And also, for the longest time, the US issued what were called silver certificates, where they could be converted into silver anytime the owner wanted to. So let me just show you a few quick examples of this. By the way, if I didn't mention it, this is the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank's website. They have their own collection of US historical notes and coins. And since we can't go there right now, you can certainly look at it online. And so let's look at a few quick examples of what are called silver certificates. And you can see it says right there, $1 silver certificate, which means I could take it to the bank and trade it in for silver anytime I felt like it. All right, that didn't stop, by the way, until 1964, at which time they abandoned this system. Now, as you know, if you look at our coins and notes, they're not redeemable for silver, and the coins do not actually contain any silver content. But up to this point in time, these silver certificates could be traded for silver, and our coins, not pennies and nickels, but dimes, quarters, half dollars, and dollars, all of them were actually made out of silver. So they had a real value to them above and beyond what it said on the face of the coin. So anyway, so if you find this interesting, you can go back later on and run through their collection and see all kinds of fun stuff that you never knew existed. So anyway, that is our background for the gold. Now, oh, what else do we need to know too? Because the money supply is defined in terms of gold, that means that by definition, our currency is also defined in terms of gold. So in other words, exchange rates were based on how much each currency could buy in terms of gold. So that's how the exchange rates were determined, by comparing how much each one was worth in terms of the price of gold. And so, for example, let's see, I think at the time, the exchange rate between the dollar and the pound during the gold standard was very much different than it is now. So at this point in time that they're referring to, the price of gold is quoted as 20.67 per ounce. I believe this is the early 20th century they're talking about. England fixes their gold at a price of £3 and 17 shillings per ounce. And therefore, the exchange rate between the two must be the ratio of those two, which is $4.86.7 per pound. So in other words, exchange rates in this system are uniquely determined by how much gold each currency could buy. And that's how it came about. Not so much by fluctuations in the marketplace, not by changes in supply and demand, but by how the currency was defined in terms of gold. All right, the idea being that the price in terms of gold should be the same. All right, see, like I said, that's a lot higher than it is now, that's for sure. All right, so then, of course, then gold could also be freely imported into and exported from each nation in response to changes in the current account deficit. All right, so I think we have some fun videos here that explain in more detail how the gold, oh, no, we've got mercantilism and David Hume coming up first, so we can learn more about them before we dive into the gold standard. All right, so let's check out this discussion about what mercantilism was all about, so that we'll understand a lot better what that meant and what, why it turned ultimately out to be not a very good philosophy. Certainly, all right, anyway, it's certainly not around today, and there's a good reason for it.
Do you want to get access to some of the top stock outs?
All right. So now you know more about mercantilism. What was that all about? Yes, well, the countries were trying to exploit each other. And of course, a lot of it had to do with their colonies, bringing them more wealth, but they wanted to make sure that those wily um, colonies did not get any ideas about trading with each other because, like they said in the video, that would have meant that they could cut out the middleman, which was the home country. All right, so now we're going to have a brief look at what David Hume's philosophy was about money in general and about mercantilism. And when that's over, we can go and now look at how the gold standard actually works. All right, so let's start by looking at our new friend David Hume. All right, so here we go. Let's see what he had to say about everything. involving money. All right. So now the next one, it's actually funny. The funny thing about this one is that it claims to be the history of the gold standard in 1 minute. Well, we'll find out if that's true or not. Okay. But I think the idea is that you're trying to get right to the point and explain to you what the gold standard is in 1 minute. They'll give us the highlights, and then we can look at some more advanced videos about this topic, because if we don't understand how the gold standard works, then a lot of what comes afterwards won't make any sense either. So what I'm going to do now is send you this link to the gold standard video. This is just the first one because it's, it's just a quick introduction. But then after that, we can focus on a more sophisticated discussion about this. So let me send that out. All right, and let's look at this thing. 1 minute. Well, that was quick. All right, so now we're going to look at a more big picture historical look at the gold standard. Okay, that was kind of fast. All right, let's check this one out.
Are your family memories trapped on VHS tapes?
All right, well, that ran a little longer than I expected, but all right. So I guess we'll have to stop here, and then we'll pick it up right here where we left off on Thursday. All right, so we're going to keep talking about the gold standard, but also how it ties in to exchange rates and see how that affects the way the current account balance responds to surpluses and deficits. All right, so I'll see you all on Thursday.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye, Professor.
See you later.